Center. He is in a senior staff meeting for a few minutes, but will join us shortly. And I am taking his place as a senior fellow here at the institution to welcome you to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. For those of you who have not been here before, I should tell you that the Wilson Center is a policy research and Institute for Scholarly Research on International Affairs, which was set up by Congress as the official monument to Woodrow Wilson by a group of thinkers in Congress who decided that while there was no monument to Woodrow Wilson prior to the 1960s, they did not want one more pile of marble on the mall, and instead they set up this organization for two reasons, one of which to honor Woodrow Wilson. The other is that there was a felt need for more scholarly research on foreign policy and international affairs, and that a fitting monument to Woodrow Wilson, who was the first U.S. president to have a doctorate, who of course was both a distinguished university president as well as president of the United States and was a true intellectual, in his honor. And that's what the center is. It has a group of scholars who come each year, a larger number of public policy scholars working for longer or shorter periods of time, and people like myself who are senior fellows, which I suppose is equivalent to being emeritus in the university setting. I'm particularly pleased to have you all here because I am also chair of the board of New Rules for Global Finance, about which you're going to hear something in a few seconds from Jo Marie Griesgraber, the executive director. And I'll moderate the discussion. I think it'd probably be a good idea if you mute or turn off your cell phones. But I want you to know that the meeting is being videotaped for webcasting at a later date. So you're on the record and will be seen both from the Wilson Center as well as from New Rules as soon as we get it put up. For that reason, we ask you when we get to the question period to raise your hand. I'll recognize you, and but wait for the microphone, because otherwise anybody watching or listening will not hear your question and only the response. And we can go from there, and we'll close at 11 o'clock at the end of the meeting. So let me turn this over to Jo Marie, who will talk about New Rules for Global Finance, and then we'll go right into the program.
Thank you, John. New Rules for Global Finance grew originally out of the Asian financial crisis with an informal network of NGOs who got caught off guard saying, what is this G22 committee writing on global financial architecture for the Clinton administration? And that started us down that path. And eventually it became a standalone organization. We are not the Coalition for New Global Financial Architecture because we had a media consultant at one time who said that's too long. So he said, call yourself New Rules, and it's New Rules for Global Finance, if you want the long version. So we have been working on reform of the IMF, I feel like since time began, but it's only in my personal history since 1989 and going forward. I'm very proud of the work that the Independent Evaluation Office is doing and has been doing, because we hosted a working group in the offices of the Overseas Development Council, where John used to be the president, and there we had diverse sectors come together on evaluation and transparency, and we came to a consensus on those areas. On no other area could we have consensus. We had diverse people, NGOs and northern and southern and academics and you name it, and if we got off topic, they hated each other. So, but on this there was agreement, and this is the only project I've ever been involved in where the implementation absolutely tracked what the recommendations were. So we're very proud of that contribution. We also work now on the Financial Stability Board, which is, we call it the biggest black box. And it's one of the two global rule writers currently, the IMF and the Financial Stability Board. And if you don't know about the FSB, you're not alone, which is why we're working on it. And our other project is South-South sharing of successful tax practices with the UN. So our focus is getting the voice, the perspectives, the needs of the poorest countries in front of the world. And that's what we do. We're a small staff. As John likes to say, they sure punch above their weight. So we invite you to check out our website, to join our listservs, and of course to contribute, because no large financial institution wants to give a lot of money to change the rules. So thank you so much for being here, and to our panelists.
We have three excellent panelists. I will introduce them each as they speak, but only briefly, because if I read out their bios, you wouldn't be able to get any of their wisdom, because there wouldn't be time. We'll start out with Ruben Lamdani, who is the Deputy Director of the Independent Evaluation Office at the IMF, which produced this marvelous report. Few institutions, I must say both public and private, like to have evaluations of what they're doing, both for its timeliness and for its impact. And this is one of them, as Jo Marie said earlier. And Ruben will lead off, as he is the author and I think director of the report. He's joined here by his colleague, Nancy Wagner, who is
Raise
here,
your hand.
who is one of the co-authors of the report, and you should feel free to add in, particularly in the discussion. Ruben, as I said, has been with the IMF. He's been director of the World Bank's research arm, and he will speak for the next 30 minutes on the substance of the report. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. I prefer to use my hands when I speak, so if I can stand up, that would make it easier. So, can you hear me? Excellent. Good morning. First, thank you to the Woodrow Wilson Center and the New Rules for inviting us to speak about our assessment of the IMF performance in the run-up to the crisis. I'm glad that Nancy, who is the co-author of this report, is here, and also Sanjay Dar, who is the author of one of the background papers, which I will refer to later, is here as well. The financial crisis that exploded in 07, 08, and the consequences of which we're still seeing, made it more clear than in a long time the importance of having an organization like the IMF that is able to help countries coordinate their policies, in addition to help finance when there are difficulties in some countries. It is because of that that it is more important that such an organization will be effective at what was set up as its main mandate at the time of its creation. In complicated parlance, that main mandate is called surveillance, which is assessment of countries' policies, sharing them with the countries, with others, and calling for corrective action when that is needed. So our study, we see it as a contribution in the direction of improving the performance of the effectiveness of the IMF, so that in facing the next crisis, it may not, hopefully, have the same problems that it had going into this one. I will say a few words about what is that this evaluation asks, what our main findings are. I'll dwell a little more on the conclusions and diagnosis, and I will emphasize our recommendations, since that is what is ahead of us, and that's the area where we're looking forward to all of you contributing to bringing about reform. We focused on the period 04 or 07 and to 07, which is the time in which the weaknesses and vulnerabilities that brought about the crisis were mounting. In fact, by sometime in 07, the crisis was probably inevitable. It could have been mitigated perhaps, but it was almost inevitable. And by 08, hell had gone loose. I will say a few words about the questions, and then I will share with you the findings from the three basic pillars that built our evaluation. First, multilateral surveillance, which is when the fund looks at the whole global economy, mostly through two vehicles, the World Economic Outlook and the Global Financial Surveillance Report, which is, they are the two main reports where the fund passes its views on macro and on finance. Then I will talk about what we learned from the surveillance, studying the surveillance in the United States and other financial centers that were at the center of the crisis, and then I'll say one or two words about surveillance in other countries. Okay, what are the main questions that our evaluation addressed? First, we asked a question that perhaps by today is obvious to everybody, which is, was the IMF effective in detecting and warning about the risks and vulnerabilities that brought about the crisis? As all of you know, the answer is no, otherwise we wouldn't have had such a deep crisis. Not because the fund would have changed the policies, because the fund only acts by proxy, but because probably countries would have reacted and adjusted their policies. The second question is if it was possible to identify these risks and vulnerabilities. To answer that question, I will bring examples, both from outside the fund, but also from inside the fund, of people that were more prescient than the fund was. Third, I will ask, what were the main factors that brought to this failure of the IMF? And then, what could be done? So, as I mentioned, we built our study on three pillars. On this global pillar, what we learned is that the fund had an overly sanguine banner message. Let me bring you back to that period. The economy all over the world was growing on a sustained manner. In fact, many people were asking whether the IMF is needed at all, because it looked as if boom and bust were a question of history. And in that general mentality, in that general approach to economic cycles, the fund took also a very sanguine attitude. The WEO, the World Economic Outlook, focused, like a laser beam on the issue of global imbalances. That, in our view, was an appropriate focus, but it didn't need to be the sole focus. And at a minimum, one should have been analyzing what were the financial impacts of those imbalances. The GFSR that looked at financial sectors did point at some of the vulnerabilities that eventually brought about the crisis. But it did it in a hodgepodge. It was pointed out to a million things, and among those million things were some of those important vulnerabilities. This doesn't detract from the fact that they saw it, it just detracts from their effectiveness. So much so that even though it was pointed in one important report of the fund, it wasn't picked up by the other one. So it clearly was not going to be picked up by people outside the fund. Well, I have examples. I mean, just let me put this slide just to motivate your reading the report, and you can see that you can pick up a copy outside. I'm not going to go through all the examples, but we brought examples that indicate very pointedly that the fund was not concerned about those vulnerabilities. Okay, what was the message of the fund on the United States? Again, the focus was on the current account deficit. As a solution for that, it was suggesting there should be fiscal retrenchment. This is not at the center of this evaluation, but that's strange since in a different part of the fund, people have focused on the fact that private savings were more of an issue than public savings. But the main issue is that financial sector weaknesses, those that brought down the US economy, were seen as a strength and not as a weakness. The fund was actually calling for faster and more innovation rather than taking a step back and seeing how innovation needed to be channeled into the right directions through appropriate regulation. And it had a sanguine message about the housing sector. And whenever, most of the time not with much concern, and when there was concern, it was mellowed by saying, but this is, you know, even if it explodes, it will be very localized. And this was true until mid-07, so until pretty late. What do we learn from the experience in the United States? Well, the fund basically went along with the Federal Reserve's views. We checked very thoroughly whether there had been censorship, whether the US authorities had forced the fund to change its message, but we really didn't find anything. Not the authorities, not the staff thought that that had been a big issue. What we did find is that some staff felt that they needed to self-censor. And that is an issue that all of us probably, is a situation that all of us probably have faced at some point in our lives. If the fund at the highest peak of its involvement in the United States probably has 6, 7 people working on the United States full time. Well, I've been asked to talk into the microphone, so I guess I have to sit down. While the US authorities have thousands and thousands of economists that look more or less like the same economists that the fund has. So it would take an enormous degree of self-assuredness and probably arrogance to take a complete different view, even though that's the reason the fund exists, to be able to take a different view in the face of what looks like authorities that are very convinced that they're doing the right thing. In addition to that, there was a blind trust in the self-correcting nature of financial markets. And there were internal issues, such as a failure in the review process. As I mentioned before, some people within the fund were seeing the problems. The GFSR was seeing some of these problems, and this was not integrated into the work of the US team. How about in other countries? I would like just to point out to one issue, which is the fund, until the crisis exploded, was preaching to many countries reforms in the direction of bringing those countries' financial sectors to be more in line with the US. Extreme examples probably are in Canada and Germany, where even as late as 06 and 07, the fund was trying to convince the authorities to move more in the direction of the financial sector model of the US. And those authorities actually didn't heed the fund advice, and they believe that that helped them cope with the crisis better than otherwise. Okay, what are the main findings of all these three pillars altogether? First, the fund failed to warn about the risk and vulnerabilities that brought about the crisis, that the banner message of the fund was very benign, that while some risks had been identified within the fund, they were like presented in the middle of a lot of other issues and not highlighted. The fund was appropriately focused on the issue of global imbalances, but it was doing that, with a single focus, when at that time there was more than, as we know now, more than one risk that needed to receive attention. The review process of the fund failed to connect the dots across the studies that were done in the institution, and very little attention was at that time given to spillovers and contagion. So, was it possible or not? Was this a black swan, or this is something that people that would have taken a more open-minded approach may have been able to see? So in the report, we have a lot of examples of people that were more prescient. Some of those examples are, of obscure academics. That still is important, because if it was possible to do it, you couldn't do it. But we also have some people that were well known to the fund, including the deputy governor of the ECB, Schiller, and Rubini, who actually lectured at the fund, and people within the fund. The financial counselor, the economic counselor, and documents that were prepared within the fund departments that basically described many of the risks, or all the risks, that eventually materialized. So the big question is why? How come a group of probably the brightest, or among the brightest 1,000 economists in the world, working with more or less the greatest access you can have to information on a global basis, how come they missed this crisis that some people believe is the biggest crisis since the Great Depression? So we bring about a list of reasons, which I think that we could classify into two groups of important reasons, and one other factor, in fact, didn't appear to be so important. First is cognitive biases and analytical weaknesses. Second are issues of governance, and what the dog that didn't bark is the political censorship. Okay, cognitive biases is a very big word for behavior that we all know. The first one is that we all feel more comfortable within a group that thinks more or less like us. Most people, at least, feel more comfortable in a group that is similar to us, thinks like us, and saying the same messages as everybody else. That's human nature. And to create incentives to go against human nature is very difficult. So the fund is composed by, the staff of the fund is composed by largely macroeconomists that have been trained more or less along the same lines of macroeconomists in most other developed countries and even in emerging markets, and that feels very comfortable aligning itself with the authorities in those countries. I'm not focusing on analytical weaknesses. This is not about the fact that they couldn't analyze the issue properly. It's just a question of behavior. We all tend to align ourselves with people that act like us, that think like us. Second is the issue of intellectual capture. And intellectual capture means that basically you align yourself automatically with what some other group of people think. In this case, it's the Fed. In fact, it's not only the Fed. The fund tends to align itself with the central banks in many, or I would say most advanced economies. Again, this is a very natural behavior because the fund would have a couple of economists working on each of these countries. You show up at a central bank where you know that they have hundreds, if not thousands of people working on exactly the same topic that you have covered over the last 3 months, and they have been covering day in, day out for all their lives. So the degree of conviction that you have to have in an alternative view to the world than they bring you has to be very, very high for you to raise it very, very strongly. In addition to that, there were like blind spots. There was a conviction that a major financial crisis was unlikely to occur in an advanced economy, as opposed to an emerging market. The truth is that having had several experiences in the last 10, 20 years, one should have been more open to that possibility. And in fact, the fund itself was concerned about a serious financial crisis coming from the global imbalances. But it seemed to be that there was a blind spot on the idea that the financial sectors could all collapse and bring the economies down. And finally, on this category of issues, there is that the profession in general and the fund in particular was very weak on analyzing the links between macro and financial problems. And the fund, in fact, had this separation. You have the WIO that focuses on macro issues and the GFSR that focuses on financial issues. So even structurally, it was organized to reinforce, or is organized to reinforce this analytical weakness. Let me point out at some of the highlights of each of these beyond what I just said. On the governance and organizational issues, let me focus on the fact that there are strong disincentives to speak truth to power. But that, to some extent you can say, well, why are you saying this? Everybody has a strong disincentive to speak truth to power, perhaps with the exception of the IEO, where we are paid to speak truth to power. Perhaps if we were paid for something else, we would also feel uncomfortable doing that. But it goes beyond that. I'll touch on this a little bit when I talk about the political constraints. But within the fund, the incentives to conform were, during the period that we studied, stronger than just what comes from the groupthink, just from what comes from the natural behavior of human beings. If you are a contrarian, you find yourself isolated. That actually is true in most organizations. In fact, we convene a very high-level advisory group to work with us on this study. Their views are reported in one of the background papers. And I was surprised that many of them said, you know, in my organization, there were people that were warning us about this crisis or that crisis for, several years, 4 or 5 years, and when the crisis came, they got promoted. But their colleagues that had conformed throughout their careers had been promoted 4 times in the same time during the period in which the crisis did not occur. So in fact, those that had conformed were the ones that promoted those that had warned. So, incentives are not only in the fund in that direction. We just specialize on focusing on the fund. There are silos and turf battles in the fund. Anyone that worked in a bureaucracy probably has never heard of this. It's the only place where there are silos. Now, I have to tell you, tearing down silos not only is difficult, but it may be a bad idea. Because silos are a very efficient way of producing widgets. When you want to, Henry Ford made a fortune creating a silo production system. The problem with silos is that the moment you want to see something different than the regular widget that you produce, a silo is unable to do that because everybody is focused exactly on what they do a million times. So one needs to find the way to manage having an efficient production system with sufficient openness so that you can detect this type of crisis. And finally, the fund is a very insular organization. We're doing another evaluation on, which will come out in the next couple of months, on research in the fund. And we found that citations in fund papers, this is even in the research, not even in the policy work, often are not only 90, but often 100% focus on studies done within the fund. We have one example of a study on private sector development in India, where there wasn't one single citation of any work done on private sector in India. This is a country where you have a few economists working on private sector development. So this is just one example of the insularity. Now, one again can understand why this is an insular organization, because when you are dedicated to deal with crisis, and most people within the fund, their biggest, most important experiences were in dealing with crisis, usually in smaller countries. You create a period de corps that it is not conducive to bringing other people's views. Okay, this is the dog that didn't bark. I mean, we checked about political pressure, and we really didn't find any. So it's very hard to elaborate about what we didn't find. So if you have questions, we can tell you all what we did to try to look for it. But what they did find is that people self-censor themselves. And we found one angle in which that may be justified by pressure from the members. And that is that there were examples of member countries, not the United States, asking for mission chiefs to be removed because they were giving the messages that they didn't like. And fear is a very, very powerful and very, very contagious disease. So if one person gets hit, that spreads very, very fast. And even if in many occasions authorities may have asked for changing some member of their team, and the fund did not react to that, what is better known is the one case where it did work. So perhaps that was behind the self-censorship. But at the end, we did not find any censorship. In sum, there were no clear warnings. That probably already knew. Some other people were more prescient but were ignored. Groupthink, intellectual capture, and governance problems were behind the weaknesses that lay behind the failure. And what I haven't said is that many of these weaknesses had been identified in earlier crises. I have to tell you that our work was made a lot easier thanks to the work that other people had done in previous crises. There were reports. We're lucky that some of those reports were done before the fund had its transparency policies, so they were not well known. So Nancy and I get the glory of having written a report that builds a lot on what other people have already said. But what is a little shocking is that the same problems still are there. The reforms that were supposed to take care of it. And people say, we have already done it. We did it all. And the same problems. It's not that, because there will always be problems, but the same problems show up in this crisis. Okay, the way forward. The fund has already taken many steps to address these weaknesses. And Ranjit, who is here from the IMF, probably will elaborate on that, so I will skip that. But they have taken many, many steps. But are these steps enough? We think that not, that they don't address the cultural shift that is needed, and that they don't bring sufficient accountability for implementing, for getting results out of the reforms that are there. And therefore, they don't guarantee that 10 years from now, hopefully 10 years from now, when the next crisis hits, the fund would have done a better job. We believe that governance changes are critical. The fund structure doesn't have sufficient clarity in who is responsible for that and how people are going to be held accountable for doing what they are supposed to do. That's true at the level of the board, management, and the staff. We believe that it is necessary to put in place a better monitoring and evaluation system within the fund in general, but in particular to monitor the implementation of reforms that are done to deal with this crisis, to see if they are yielding the results that are expected, and if not, to take corrective actions. Otherwise, nothing guarantees. We don't know if our recommendations, even if applied all of them, will yield the results that we want. What we do know is that after 1 year of implementing them, you will be able to see if you're going in the right direction, and then you will be able to perhaps take corrective actions. And finally, we think that on the governance area, that there is a need to recalibrate the fund's approach to risk assessment. The fund systematically errs more on the side of calling too many risks and vulnerabilities in low-income and emerging markets, and too few such vulnerabilities and risks in advanced economies. So perhaps a recalibration of that is in place. We have 5 clusters of recommendations. The first 3 have to do with the ability of the fund and fund staff to detect and state the messages on risks. One is that people should be able to more freely speak truth to power. Two, that the fund needs to have a consistent message that is the same when you deal with the macro issues than with the financial issues, when bilateral and multilateral, with advanced economies and with emerging markets. And for that, you need to have greater candor within the institution. People should be able to speak up their mind. Then we have one cluster that deals with how to bring about more teamwork. And finally, there is one about the analytical issues of better integrating financial and macro assessment issues. And this latter point is where we believe that the fund is making, at least is more eager in making progress than on the others. Let me just give you, I mean, we believe that fund staff and management are better probably prepared than us to identify specific measures of how to implement these clusters. You know, they know the business better than we do. There are more of them, and they're probably smarter than we are. But just to illustrate what we mean by each of these clusters, we gave some specific examples. And let me just mention one or two of those. We believe that there is a need for a self-assessment at the institutional level of the fund. This is very common in corporations in the private sector after the Enron debacle that was introduced in the corporate sector. This is quite common in other international organizations. This is not being done in the fund. We believe that there is a need to integrate better the messages of the WIO and the GFSR, and we see no reason why the fund should not come with a single statement on its views on the global economy that is obviously then internally consistent. We think that in order to encourage candor and diverse views, you need to seek the views of others, probably bring outsiders to talk to the board of the fund, but also that perhaps a unit could be created of people that rotate in and out from there, probably from outside the fund, just to be looking at the big concerns. This is not about creating bigger and better models to identify risk. This is just to bring a complete different view, a different perspective. People that are outside of the groupthink, outside of the process of creating the widgets that the fund creates. On overcoming the silo behavior, there is a need to make people more clearly accountable for integrating. There is a review process in the fund. People that work on that review process should be accountable for connecting those dots. It cannot be that, nobody looks back. This has to do with what I was mentioning before, that in the fund, nobody seems to be looking back on who was responsible to do this and why they didn't do it. And on integrating macro and financial, the fund is doing a lot. We believe that there is a need to strengthen the FSAP, the mandatory financial sector assessment program that is now mandatory for the largest financial centers. We think that beyond what is being done now, that is what has been done before on advanced economies, it would be a good idea to look at the institutional issues that are otherwise done only on low income and emerging markets. So these are the main recommendations that we have. As I said, we don't have a monopoly on the ideas on how to implement, how to devise changes, but we believe that our report identified what were the key levers that needed to be shifted in order to bring about a big change. and you will then hear from Ranjit about what was the reaction from staff, management, and the board. So that's the end of my presentation, so I will skip that. Thank you very much.
Ruben, thank you very much. That was a very concise summary of a very important report. I kept thinking how many other organizations I'm familiar with operate in the same manner. It's very, very interesting. We've been joined by Kent Hughes in the back. You can move up front if you'd like, by the way, who's director of the program on America and the global economy here. And he had a senior staff meeting this morning, which he had to attend, and is now joining us. And thank you very much for your sponsoring this program, Kent. And I'm delinquent in saying that the coffee and food that you've been given is comes from the benefits of the Heinrich Boll Foundation, who's the third co-sponsor of this meeting. And I was delinquent in not saying that at the very beginning. Let me then turn to Damon Silvers, who's director of the policy department at the AFL-CIO. Each of the discussions has 15 minutes, so we can open up for discussion because there are a lot of experts in this room too, and not just an audience. So Damon, the floor is yours.
Good morning. I'm required to say at least the next 4 or 5 days when I talk about matters related to the financial crisis that I'm also the deputy chair of the Congressional Oversight Panel for TARP, and my comments are mine and not the oversight panel, right? Not theirs, not the staff's, et cetera. In a week, we go out of existence, and therefore, you may be the last people to get this particular caveat. It's really a great pleasure to be here and to talk about this report because, and it's sort of ironic in a way that Ruben ended his presentation, one of the bullets in the end of his presentation was somewhat critical of the IMF for not having an evaluative process here, because this evaluative process, the one that you've just heard about, is, as far as I am aware, unique among the major institutions that failed during the financial crisis. In the work that I've done on the oversight panel, one of my particular obsessions has been the absence of this type of self-assessment and the absence of what one might expect to be accountability that would follow from self-assessment at institutions like the Federal Reserve, in particular the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the OECD, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. Each of these institutions pretty clearly failed abysmally to do its basic functions during the period between 2004 and 2008. And seems to be moving on as though they had succeeded wildly. And it's really, I think, a great tribute to both the people involved in creating the Independent Evaluation Office, the Independent Evaluation Office itself, and the people at the fund who appear to have cooperated in this report. I didn't hear anything that suggests that people refused to talk. That this document exists and this process has been undergone. As I said, it is unique as far as I can tell. And that's really a very disturbing fact about the current state of financial regulation and global governance, both in the United States and in international institutions, the fact that this report is so unique. So having sort of established that, I want to move on to sort of make a set of comments both about what the analytic findings were and what the conclusions one would draw from those are. Although we don't have a formal assessment of this kind for some of the institutions I mentioned a moment or two ago, I think one thing that's clear from this report, which is not unique to the IMF, is that there were people inside the fund who, quote, saw it coming. They may not have been the majority of the fund staff, and their views may have been a little hard to find if you were looking in, say, 2006 or 2007 at the fund's publications, but those people were there. By the way, this is not unique. I mean, I think people who know who Ned Gramlich was at the Federal Reserve played a similar role. And then there are people in the outside world, of course, one of them sitting next to me, who spotted some of these things pretty much on the time frame that one would expect, as Ruben said, a collection of the world's 1,000 smartest economists to figure it out. So what happened to those people? Now, I think it's clear from the report, and what happened to those views? It's clear from the report that those views were, at best, downplayed in the fund's publications and work. It's particularly striking to me. Well, I'm going to make 2 points about this. One, it is particularly striking to me, having looked closely at the events that brought on the financial crisis, not so much that the fund was oblivious in 2004 or 2005, because at that point you had to be fairly, say, focused on, say, the U.S. residential mortgage market and thinking 4 or 5 steps beyond that. And there were people who did that, and Ned Gramlich was one of them. But what's really striking is the fund's posture during 2007. And I'll tell you a little anecdote about 2007. I happened to be with one of the very top officials of the Treasury Department on the day that the 2 Bear Stearns MBS hedge funds failed in the spring of 2007. And I'm not going to tell you who this person was because I actually have a great deal of respect for the team and so forth, and this is not going to make him look good. I turned to this person and said to him, "Is this something we should be worried about?" Now, I wish I could say that, like Dean, I had understood that the housing finance was going to kill the world economy. I didn't. I was worried about hedge funds as a source of systemic risk, and because of the amount of leverage that we believed hedge funds were laying on. And so I said to this high Treasury official, "Is this something to be worried about?" And I remember as we were walking to the elevator, he said, no, he said, "There's just a couple of idiots at Bear Stearns." Now, between I don't believe he was lying to me. I think that's what he thought on that day. But by September 2007, that same person was terrified and knew what was coming. And I talked to him at that time, and it was a whole different deal. I mean, he didn't say that the world financial situation was going to completely collapse, but he was very worried in the fall of 2007. Between those 2 dates is where anybody who had real data and insight figured it out. So you could say in the end of 2006, well, maybe you didn't understand. By September 2007, everybody understood. The only question was, how bad was it going to be? And so where was the fund during that period? I think that question requires, more than what is in this report. And that's not a criticism per se, it's just an observation about detail. Secondly, I want to talk about this notion of political influence and political power. Rubin made a point several times of making clear that he couldn't find any instance of active political muscle wielding to alter fund conclusions or fund analysis. And I'm certain that that's true, but I think we need to understand how limited that statement is. And limited in 2 senses. One is that, as he pointed out in his presentation, self-censorship is rife in all bureaucracies and all large institutions. So people understand which way the wind blows and what kind of things get rewarded and what kind of things get you ignored, left in a little cubicle to write to yourself. You don't need political muscle to enforce a regime like that. But secondly, and with respect to the fund, I think that there's a critical thing to understand here, at least that I've, in my very limited interactions with the fund, come to appreciate. The channels of political influence into the fund from the fund's major member countries do not go through unwilling conduits. You only get the person telling an oversight body that there's been political muscle when that person has themselves felt the pressure of being forced to do something that they don't want to do. If the channels of that kind of political force are exerted through essentially agents of those countries within the fund itself, you'll never hear about it because it'll never be perceived as anything like coercion. So I think we ought to understand just what a narrow conclusion this is, and how difficult the real nature of the political problem here is to uproot. Now I want to make a couple of comments about intellectual issues. It's really striking to me that, at least from looking at this report, that no one at the fund appears to have ever looked at some very basic numbers about things like the housing market in the United States. The ratio of housing prices to incomes. Right? This is the most simple number. And it clearly, starting in 2003 or 2004, showed a bubble developing. Now, I don't know what the explanation for that is. Maybe it's, maybe the groupthink and all that explains it. But it would be interesting to know what the answer is of the 1,000 smartest economists in the world as to why they didn't look at specific numbers. And perhaps Ruben knows the answer and can tell us in a minute. And then finally, a point about in terms of intellectual issues, a point about perspectives. The document makes the very a point that, and I think they cite Paul Krugman for this point, that economists tend to like elegant theories over data. And what I think is striking, and I think that's a valid point. It's a really interesting thing about the difference between social sciences and physical sciences. There's a long history that elegant theories in physical sciences actually turn out to be true. The opposite is true about social sciences. It's something to be kept in mind. What does turn out to have some relevance, I believe, and here I reflect my own intellectual sort of ancestry, is some historical perspective. And it's clear, I think, from this report that was completely lacking. And I think it was made clear in what Ruben said in his presentation. We did have some hints of what was about to happen and some patterns that we could have looked at, the fund could have looked at. For example, the high-tech bubble in the United States. My view that in certain respects, the financial crisis of 2008 and the mortgage bubble and the high-tech bubble that preceded it are all one phenomenon. One could also look at the S&L crisis in the United States, very, very similar. There's a decent argument that the United States made a I think there's a decent argument, sort of speaking sort of historically, that the United States made a structural shift in its economy in the late 70s and early 80s, and that all of these things are the consequence of that structural shift. The S&L crisis, the high-tech bubble, long-term capital management, the U.S. interaction with the Asian financial crisis, and finally, and hopefully finally, the 2008 crisis. Now, having some people who think historically around someplace in the building might be helpful. Now, what can we conclude then about all of this? Looking forward, we saw the slide that Ruben put up of all the things that have been done by the fund to try to integrate financial and macroeconomic analysis. And perhaps all that'll work out great. However, at the moment, I think the threat sort of lies elsewhere, but these same issues of groupthink are very much on the table. The issues that are facing the fund today and in its interaction with other international institutions and the major economies of the world really go to the issue of, is this crisis over? And is it the right response to if the crisis is over, and I think that's a really big if, and I don't want to associate myself with agreeing with that proposition, I just want to say that that's the kind of mentality we're in right now. If the crisis is over, is it a good idea to revert to essentially the set of economic nostrums that the fund was pushing as the crisis developed? Right? Is it the right idea to move today? Is it the right idea to move today toward fiscal austerity and the destruction of economic security in the world in those countries that have any for working people? Is it time to do that? And two, is it ever time to do that? Now, from what I have seen of the fund, I would say that in contrast, for example, to the OECD, there's a live argument within the fund about this right now. But that live argument, and the fund did an event, 2 weeks ago here in Washington, that really put that argument on stage in a big way. But that the fact that if you step back a second and remove elements of groupthink and all the things that are in this report, this conversation, the fact that there's another side to this argument, the fact that there are folks who are saying, let's just go back to the agenda of 2006 and 2007 at the IMF, that's a completely intellectually untenable position. It has no intellectual support at all. It is the consequence, it is the living embodiment of political influence and groupthink. Now, and of course the stakes are very, very high, particularly if you believe, as I do, that we're not really out, that the crisis is not really over. Certainly from the perspective of the people who pay my salary, we've talked about people who pay people's salaries, 15 million unemployed in the United States, the highest level of unemployed worldwide ever been measured, right, in terms of just the count, the head count. Again, in the United States, we've had 3-4 million families thrown out of their homes. We expect to see 13 million before it's over. Right? That suggests it ain't over by a long shot. By the way, those are Wall Street estimates. They're not, the AFL-CIO's independent estimates. Those things all suggest a crisis that's ongoing, and I'd be happy to talk in greater length about why I think that's true about the financial sector, in addition to in terms of what workers experience. And so the last question I think that this report raises is if the fund remains in a posture where where essentially, for one reason or another, right, it's the major member states effectively, if even simply through intellectual means, dictate the way the fund thinks. Two questions, I think, have to be posed. The first is, if you look at the fund today, after all these events have occurred, and if you look at who is doing what at the fund, and who's occupies positions of influence and who doesn't, would a rational person conclude that groupthink and obedience to the more powerful member states was or was not a good career strategy? It really representing literally the millions of people just within the American labor movement who have lost their jobs, right, as a result of these failures. I don't mean by the fund specifically, but there are tens of millions, perhaps hundreds of millions of people worldwide who have lost their jobs. Other than, if I can't recall any policymaker at the professional level in either the United States government or in international institutions who's on a food line. I don't know where those people are. And this is not merely a matter of like social justice, this is a matter of institutional effectiveness. Right? As Ruben points out, no private corporation would function this way, or at least none that don't have unique kinds of protections would function this way. Of course, some that have unique protections have functioned precisely this way in the United States and perhaps some other places. So that's question one. Question two is, how does the IMF structurally become a more intellectually independent institution? Right? These recommendations, outside advisors, self-assessments, they could be very helpful. I should point out that our Congressional Oversight Panel made precisely the outside advisor recommendation to the United States government in our financial reform report that Congress asked for. Many aspects of that report are embedded in Dodd-Frank. That one is not. Right? There is no body of independent experts that will be advising the United States government as to where the next economic crisis will come from. Perhaps you'll have better luck with the fund. But it's not at all clear to me that given the fundamental structure of the fund, that these types of recommendations will be sufficient, right, to undo the subtle sort of combination of intellectual and political and career incentives that I think this report has done such a good job in illuminating. And it may be too much to ask of the Independent Evaluation Office that they should put forward those deeper structural reforms, but somebody ought to. I'll stop there.
Good job for new rules. Dean Baker, as many of you know, is co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. If I read his publications list and his bio, we'd go on forever. But I will simply say that if you don't read his blogs, posts, you should do so immediately because they're extremely useful. And if you want to give him the access to it, I'd be happy to have you do so. And let me turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to speak here. I'll give you my, since you did the plug, I'll carry through www.cepr.net, and I have a blog, Beat the Press, that you could find on our main page. We also have a CEPR blog that I'll advertise as well. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I appreciate having Damon speak before me. He made a lot of the points I would want to make, so it gives me a chance to go off on some different ground. I'll also say I really do want to compliment the Independent Valuation Committee, and like Damon, I just wish we had this for the Fed, for the Treasury, for the Securities and Exchange Commission, on, and it is very nice to have that as a model. Having said that, naturally, I'm going to say you guys didn't go far enough. The 3 points I want to make is, first of all, that this was a crisis that was easy to see, and I'll go through the basic story quickly, but I emphasize the issue that's a housing bubble. There was a financial crisis, but I'm going to emphasize the housing bubble. I think that's first and foremost the fundamental story here. My reason for saying that is housing bubbles are simple, financial crises can be complicated. The second point is that it is important to understand there were other tools. This is a point kind of making in passing. There's other tools than the interest rate. So I don't know how many times I get into arguments, debates with economists, and they go, oh, so you would have wanted the Fed to raise interest rates. And I say no. And then they go, you would have wanted the Fed to raise interest rates. No. That's a last recourse. I want to talk about the other tools. If the other tools don't work, then you raise interest rates. Then I want to pick up the point that Damon made, perhaps in passing, but I really want to drive this home. There have to be sanctions. That means economists get fired. I'll let you think about that one for a moment as I go through the other 2 points. It always strikes people, usually think I'm joking. I'm not. I'm an economist. We believe in sanctions. We believe in discipline. If you mess up on your job, you get fired. All right. Well, to start the basic point, easy to see, as I say, I think it's a housing bubble. I'm not saying that to be contentious. I look at the economy today, and, you know, Damon's pointing out that we have 25 million people unemployed, underemployed, giving up work, looking for work altogether. We have millions of people who've lost their homes, millions more who will lose their homes. And I go, how would that have been different if we did not have the financial crisis? What would be different today? And basically, I'm pretty hard-pressed to say very much. Okay, I don't doubt, I'm not disputing for a moment that if, you know, we could have thought of worse scenarios. If we go back to September, October of 2008, we could have thought of worse scenarios, you know, so we kept the financial system operating. That was a good thing. But if we look at the economy today, given that we've had a plunge in house prices, which was caused by the collapse of the bubble, how would it have been different if we didn't have the financial crisis? I don't see any fundamental way it would have been different. So that's why I emphasize the housing bubble. It's not just to be contentious. I really do think that that's true. And I understand it's an international story. The housing bubble was not just a U.S. phenomenon. There were bubbles in Spain and Ireland and England, most of the OECD countries, not all of them. Germany, for better or worse, escaped that, and there were a few others. But and it took different forms. But, you know, but it was a story, first and foremost, to my mind, of a housing bubble. Now, in saying that, it astounds me. This was not something you had to be hugely prescient to see. We had a 100-year-long trend in nationwide house prices in the United States, 100-year-long trend in the largest market in the world where house prices just tracked inflation. That's a real long trend in a really big market. My reason for emphasizing that is, you know, as an economist, usually we just look at post-war data. If we have a trend 30 years, that's a big deal. It's 100 years. And it's a large market. You know, you could have erratic movements in the price of chrome or zinc. We all understand that. You know, these aren't huge markets. Things affect them, you know, in odd ways. It's a huge market. Okay, so what was it that led to a huge divergence in house prices? By their peak in 2006, house prices adjusted for inflation were more than 70% above their long-term trend. So what explained that? You'd think as an economist, you'd want to go, okay, well, what was this? And I followed this closely, of course, and I first actually started following this closely at the instigation of Alan Greenspan when he said there was no bubble. That was 2002. And at that point, house prices had already risen by 30% adjusted for inflation above their long-term trend. And he said, well, you know, there's been a big growth in income. You go, no, there hasn't been a big growth in income. You presumably know better than that. He's chair of the Federal Reserve Board. He has data. There was good growth 96 to 2000.
The website, and thanks again. We hope to see you soon.
Thank you all. That was really excellent. I'm gonna make the Carol,